So I love these kettle roasted peanuts from Meijer. Okay, if you've been around my house at all, you know this about me. They're these really crunchy peanuts, and they're so satisfying. And luckily for me, they had remained on the shelves at Meijer throughout the pandemic. But then, just in the last few months, all of a sudden, they were gone. I blame Jif. I don't know what Jif is doing, but they took all the peanuts out of circulation. So now, for the past 6 months, I had been trying all sorts of new peanuts. I've been ordering different ones on Amazon and having them delivered. I've been doing all this stuff to try to find the peanuts that they claim will have that maximum crunchiness. Finally, after trying many, these kettle roasted ones returned to the shelves about 4 weeks ago. And all of a sudden, I had a real dilemma. My dilemma was, how many bags of these peanuts can I buy and keep fresh enough to enjoy at that crunchy level? I stared that first day that they were there. It was like, the golden sun had lit up that bin. Oh, they're back. And I stared there at that bin, and I had this real crisis moment because I didn't want to be that guy, that wipes out all of them. I didn't want to be that guy. But I really missed these particular peanuts, and I didn't want to miss out on my chance to get some. I was thinking, what if some guy comes through here and just wipes them out before I can get enough to last me a little while? I wanted to make sure that I wouldn't be left without an opportunity to enjoy these nuts again for another 6 months. That'd be awful. So, I bought 3 bags out of the 15 or so that were there. But before I tell you that, that sounds like, oh, you did a good job. No. I basically convinced myself that way everyone had a chance, and then every time I'm at the store, which is all the time, I will just buy one more bag and add to my stockpile. Now, truth be told, right now, I've kind of backed off of that, in these 4 weeks, so I only have a few bags at home right now, so I'm not hoarding too much. But, I'm at the store a lot, and I check that bin every single time. Now, I know that there's been some really annoying, and probably depending on your line of work, there's been some really challenging breakdowns in our supply chain over these past years. And it has been really bizarre. But let's just consider and get some perspective on what we have here in the United States. I'm guessing that almost all of us here, we have running water, right? We have electricity. We have plenty of food to eat, too much, that's my issue. And we have enough money in our pockets or in the bank to keep us taken care of for weeks, months, maybe years at a time. So let's just pause and just reflect on that for a second and realize how privileged that makes us. We are part of the top 1% when we consider the entire world population. Yet, we're also, we're who we are. That's never quite seems to be enough for us. So we complain about the price of a gallon of gas. I get it. I do too. We complain about not being able to find our favorite brand of whatever it is on the store shelves. I've already owned that. We get indignant with our favorite coffee shop because they had to raise their prices a quarter. Outrageous. Sorry, Pete. Pete's here today, and that's a little shout out for Pete. We are continually stressed, and we are irritated about all of these inconveniences that we face. However, for most of us, these kinds of things really don't make any major difference in our overall quality of life. We complain about so many things which really don't mean anything. They wouldn't mean anything to us if we just didn't have so much. And the more cutting truth is that if we didn't think we were entitled to so much. In our indulgence, we have the privilege of spending time griping about what I like to call #first world problems. We just do. But what this is revealing is it's showing us something, because one thing seems to be sure for most of us. Having more money, having more comfort, and more ease is not helping us get to the root of our unsettledness, the root of our angst and our troubles. These supposed ideals of a good life are not filling whatever voids we have in our lives. They don't fix our personal and kind of the whole systemic brokenness around us. They don't save us from unhappiness, and it doesn't keep us from discontent. And in our main account this morning, Jesus is in the middle of this serious discussion, and he's there in front of what we are told is a crowd that had gathered. If you just read a little bit earlier in 12, you'd see this. And in the middle of this important teaching, it's a long teaching, a couple chapters worth, someone in the crowd interrupts Jesus and says, "Teacher, order my brother to give me a fair share of the family inheritance." It's kind of this, okay kind of moment, like, this is an interesting time for someone to bring that up. And I'm also not sure, as a side note, that it's a good idea to just blurt things out in front of Jesus, because you don't know where he's going to take that and run with it. And before we get too far into our discussion about this parable, I just want to give us a tiny bit of first century background info that helps highlight why this actually may not have been that peculiar. Because in Bible times, civil disputes were regularly founded on how to interpret the scriptures. So therefore, you would go to a teacher of the law or a rabbi, and you would ask them to intervene and help rule on matters. Also, inheritance laws instructed that the older brother was actually going to receive double of what any other brothers were to receive. So given the fact that that was like a law on the books, it's clear that this particular brother, we don't know whether he was the older or the younger, he felt like he didn't get a fair share of what he had coming to him. But all that aside, there's just some info there for you. Jesus uses this call from this man for arbitration as a teaching opportunity, because at its core, this dispute is really about something much deeper. It's about something that we all struggle with. It's about something that puts a wall between us and our ability to love God and to love others as ourselves. It's the cause of countless family disputes. It's the cause of divorce sometimes. It's the cause of war. It even has the power to move us towards coldness or apathy or maybe just contempt for the rest of the human race. And that something is what we call greed. And greed is one of those things. It's one of those words that by definition, when we hear it, it simply has no positive meaning. There isn't anything good about greed. And I think most of us, if we just ponder that for a quick second, we would agree that that's true, at least kind of on the surface level, right? The face value. We would agree with that. But you knew that was coming, right? When we walk out of the doors of this gathering, do our lives tell a different story? I mean, to some extent, we are all preoccupied with the pursuit of stuff and the hopes of getting more of what we want most. Just consider that one of the most booming businesses out there, and you'll see them popping up everywhere, you have our storage units, right? Like, it's a crazy thought. I don't think that's happening in other places, but it happens here in the States because we have an abundance of everything. We can't even house everything that we kind of want to keep our tabs on in our own home or in our own yard and all around. It's a crazy thought. But to this issue of greed, Jesus then introduces our parable for today. And the punchline, if you will, of this parable comes right at the end of the story. It is the purpose for which Jesus told it. And I want to be clear right here, so please hear this. The problem in this parable, what Jesus is getting at, is not big barns. Aaron, you're off the hook, right? Whew. Aaron's got one of the biggest pole barns I've ever seen. Sorry, Aaron, you get the shout out this morning. But the problem is not big barns. The problem is not big inheritance. The problem is if our lives, represented by the barns, are only filled with ourself. Hear that again. The problem isn't the big barns or the big inheritance. The problem is if our lives are only filled with ourself. This is what Jesus said right at the end of what we just read a little bit ago. He said, that's what happens when you fill your barn with self and not with God. What Jesus is trying to help his listeners see is the danger of greed that comes by way of inflated ego. Okay, hang in there with me. Greed that comes by way of our inflated ego. And what I mean by ego here is our self-image, our self-confidence. And yes, okay, I'm going to say that the last time. Hear me on this one because this is important. It is important for each of us to have a positive sense of worth. It is necessary because, boy, if we don't have some level of a positive ego, life's challenges come after you and they will cripple you, correct? We need to have some positivity there. However, when all of a sudden that becomes an inflated opinion of ourselves, it's just as damaging, or maybe even more so, than poor self-image. And another key reminder here as we really get to the meat and potatoes of this is that Jesus here is not only dealing with individuals. We are told he's talking to a crowd that had gathered. And as Jesus is prone to do, he addresses both the personal and the communal relationship in his story. Think about it. He is bringing a message that God is calling all of his people, namely here the nation of Israel, to something better. He is calling them to a way of living that is more grace-filled and more redemptive than just focusing on themselves. So as we go forward and we engage with this rich man and his inflated ego, let's make sure we don't only isolate this story as an individualized teaching, but also as a correction for God's entire family. Because it's good for us to acknowledge here that societies and individuals, both, can think themselves into a glossy self-image of sorts. And they can think themselves into a blatant dose of self-importance. And our rich man, he had a really unhealthy sense of himself, resulting in some unchecked greed and preoccupation with getting more of what he wanted. He had one focus, and it was looking out for number one. And his unquenchable ego exposes a couple of familiar and damaging traits. And we're going to look at that. Have you ever been chatting with someone and you've noticed that they say I or my like all the time? That even when you are sharing, it just seems like they're waiting to quickly turn the conversation back to being about them. Maybe they kind of position themselves as the hero of every story. Or maybe they're the person that always has a better story. They're the one-upper. Okay? Yeah, we know those folks. But then, when something inevitably goes wrong, they're always the person that has an excuse for why it wasn't their fault. Yeah. I'm sure we know some people like that. And if we're being extra honest, maybe we could be that person too. The rich man in our story never had a day where he needed or wanted to see anything beyond himself. The focus of his entire world was him. He was at the center of it. And this comes into picture in our very short parable with a couple of key tells that I want us to look at. First, we read that this guy was so self-focused that he only sought out his own advice. He was confident that he had all the right answers. He already had all the correct ideas. And just consider that exclusively talking to ourselves as a way of seeking some advice is not just a bit odd, that's kind of a strange thing, but it's actually quite precarious too. How limited are we when we only consider our own perspective? If we only seek our own advice, what happens if it turns out to be bad advice? King Solomon, pretty smart guy, he said it like this. He says in Proverbs 12:15, "Fools think they know what is best, but a sensible person listens to advice." When we are self-focused, not only do we run the risk of incomplete guidance, we also miss out on the opportunity to engage with others. I know it's a quick story, but the rich man never considers that he could share his abundance with other people. He doesn't give time to think about those around him in need. There was no consideration of who might need it even more. I mean, his barns were full. Jesus' parable makes it clear that this man was already rich, yet his concern was just getting more for himself. I mean, what a missed opportunity, right? If you remember some weeks ago, we talked about the shrewd manager. And at least that shrewd manager gave a little blessing to others in order to get a little payback later in life. Our rich man, he had a problem with being too self-focused. But that isn't all. He was also entirely self-absorbed. Just consider this, that his conversation with himself continues in the parable. And he says, "And I'll say to myself, self, you've done well. You've got it made and can now retire. Take it easy and have the time of your life." I mean, this man had barns that were stuffed to the max. But it's pretty clear that the most abundant commodity that he had was an overflowing view of himself. We've already alluded to this, but having some self-confidence is a good thing. Knowing that we belong and we have worth is good. We do need to understand and know our strengths and what abilities we have. And we should always be reminded when we gather together here that we are deeply loved and cherished children of God. We are His family. But we can easily take it too far and we start to get absorbed in only ourselves. And that's a big-time problem. Because we get full of ourselves. And then we start to believe that we are somehow owed something. We assume that once we get ours, because we're the special ones, I always like thinking that I'm my parents' favorite, even though I know it's my sister. But I like to imagine that. I mean, we assume that we're going to get ours because we're special. And then we get to take it easy. And we get to just have the time of our lives. But throughout the gospel accounts, Jesus asks us to love and consider others as we do ourselves. And that's the real rub of following Jesus, right? The Bible speaks an awful lot about dying to our inflated ego, dying to our self-focus. And it's because this, ultimately, dying to self, is what our spiritual transformation is all about. But we all wrestle with some self-importance and the baggage that comes right along with that. We all wrestle with the desire to be right, to feel superior. We also wrestle with this idea that we want to feel innocent, right? We say things like, well, I'm just a sinner saved by grace. And that's not the worst saying, but it's how we dismiss that we've got anything to own by our own doing. We like to pretend that we get to carry a little extra self-importance because we're special. But Jesus wants our focus to be on Him and to be rooted in living His ways, filling up our lives with Him. But most often we would rather have kind of split loyalties, separate ones. That way, we can still maintain our little moments of selfish ego indulgence over here. And here in the States, we use words like independence and freedom and winning, and we like that best. And these values are well developed in each one of us, and guess what? That plays out here in our churches too across the states. We value those most. But as believers, our pursuit of Jesus, doing this together as His family, is more about dying than it is about our greatness and our exceptionalism. Jesus would tell us that our self-importance and our arrogance must go. He says it like this in Luke chapter 9. He says, anyone who intends to come with me has to let me lead. You're not in the driver's seat. I am. Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. Follow me and I'll show you how. Self-help is no help at all. Self-sacrifice is the way, my way, to finding yourself, your true self. What good would it do to get everything you want and lose you, the real you? So I want to offer us here just an actionable step as we near the end of our time. Basically, how can we participate in, how can we exercise and practice dying to self in order that we would be able to more readily deal with our inflated ego? And this is what I want you to consider this morning. Examine when you are prone to blaming, complaining, and defending. Blame, complain, and defend. This comes from an author and speaker, Brian Kite. But each of these actions right here are actions that we choose in favor of something better, something more helpful, such as, just taking responsibility, owning our attitudes and our actions, and practicing being honest and authentic. And when we hear these words, right, blame, complain, defend, it's clear to us right away that these typically would not be ideal responses for any of us. Let alone, as followers of Jesus, those are not great characteristics of how we respond. But it is quite common for us, guilty of all these too, to continue choosing to go this route. And ultimately, what they are, they're actions that are impulse choices that seek to protect our ego above all else. So when an event takes place in our lives, one that requires some form of a response, those of us with a bit of an inflated ego, we often default to deflecting responsibility, to talking negatively, and we snap at any critique that comes our way. Author Brian Kite, I've mentioned him already here, but he states it like this about each one of these words. He says, blaming indicates you are irresponsible and untrustworthy. Yikes. Complaining makes you discouraged and makes you unenjoyable to others. Defensiveness reveals your ego and your fragility. Making things worse in places where people gather together and they share in experiences and community, like a church family. Blaming, complaining, defending, they are contagious and they are a poison, halting any progress of real transformation as it spreads from person to person to person. And I'm concerned that we, that's a collective we, I'm involved in this, that we as a community of believers, I think we've adopted, I'm going to guess more passively than intentionally, but we've kind of adopted this idea of blaming, complaining, and defending as a means of how we just kind of operate and get through life. Just accepted it. And this has fed a bit of our self-importance. It's protected our overinflated egos. And it's gotten us off course in our pursuit of the true way of Jesus. It's prevented us from filling up our barns with God. And instead, I think it's left us with lives that are a lot more hollow, full of self-absorbed filler. So, with this in mind, just a couple last questions here to ask ourselves. First, starting with the individual. When are you most likely to blame, complain, and defend? I think one of them I alluded to, I think during prayer time there, but I think a lot of times it's when we're physically maxed out, right? My energy reserves are depleted. And if anyone dares to come at me blaming me for something, I'm going to blame them. I'm going to complain because I'm exhausted and I'm tired of people. I'm going to defend my actions at all costs. I think that's common, but maybe it's not just physically we're tapped out. Maybe we're emotionally fatigued. Maybe you notice this happens when you're a bit financially strapped and stressed out with that. Maybe it's the times where we just feel a little spiritually dry, or God feels very distant. But as we consider those things, what is that revealing to us about where we might be filling our lives with only ourselves, not God? And then collectively, let's just consider here together, when are we, as the family of God, most likely to participate in the B, C, and D? Where has the Christian community built up an overly inflated ego, full of a lot of us and not a whole lot of God? You see, when we face challenges and threats and critique, in our parable it said, your life is going to be taken tonight. When we face those threats and the critique and the challenges, what are we blaming? What are we complaining about? And what are we defending? Because if we will pause and just examine that, it will reveal what we've been filling our lives with, what we've been filling our families with, our churches. And folks, the unfortunate part, it's been what we've been filling our world with. The truest Christian life is most about letting go. And we must let go of our need to know everything and to always be right. We are to let go of our need and our want to just be in control of everything and everyone. We have to let go of our desire to feel superior, to feel special, and to be seen and recognized. I think it's a safe bet that none of us in this room want to be called a fool by God. Hopefully a few heads nod. That sounds awful. We don't want to be found only pretending to be part of God's family. So how do we make sure that that doesn't happen? Well, we can actually choose limits instead of all the indulgences. We, God's people, we can cultivate in us a deep sense of compassion and not greed. And we can pursue confidence in and reliance upon God instead of filling our barns up with self-sufficiency. I know that just getting here to the end of this message, it can really hurt to be honest and admit that you might have an overinflated ego. And if it stings a little, I empathize with you because I've been sitting with this for a week. And it's been daggers all week long. So I understand. But this is the good thing. With our God of love, it is never too late for each one of us and collectively as a church to change our minds. That's what it means to repent, is to change your mind. So that's my encouragement to you this morning. Change your heart. Change your mind. You can repent of this. Begin by examining what are the times you blame, you complain, and defend, and be willing to die to yourself. I want to leave you with this. This is from Father Richard Rohr, who's one of my favorite. Not everybody probably likes Richard, but he's a good dude. And he says it really succinctly here. He says, we suffer to get well. We surrender to win. We die to live. And we give it away to keep it. If you've signed up to be on Team Jesus, welcome to the party. This is the work. I can tell you in my 39 years, it hasn't ended yet. There's a lot of work to do. There's a ways to go. So let's continue marching that way, folks. Let's fill up our lives with a lot more God and a lot less of ourselves. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we are thankful for reminders that have been coming week after